Just like in the days when the Apostle Paul wrote his first letter to Timothy, we are in a time when so many people are being led away from true faith in Christ by the many distorted versions of the gospel that are being preached all around us. And just like in Paul's time, we also are in a day when people desperately need to hear the truth as it really is. But it's not enough to just teach them the truth accurately. They need to actually see the truth in our lives. We see that in today's reading from 1 Timothy 4-6. In chapter 4, Paul's talking about false teachers who were saying that people shouldn't get married and that they have to be very strict about avoiding all kinds of different foods. Apparently, this comes from a belief that was common in those days that the material world was evil and therefore it should be avoided as much as possible. Paul tells Timothy that it's not right eating that nourishes our souls, it's right doctrine. And not for the sake of being right, but for the sake of being godly. So be very careful to teach them well, Paul says, but don't just say it. In your conversations, in your behavior, in your love, in your faith, in your purity, let them see a living example in you, Timothy, of what it means to be a follower of Christ. Chapter 5, Paul addresses some different ways that the love of Christ will impact the way that we live together as the community of faith. When a fellow believer is caught in a sin or is teaching something that isn't quite right, treat them like family, not as an opponent. If they're older, he says, appeal to them as you would a father or a mother. And if they're younger, appeal to them as you would a brother or a sister. He goes on to talk about the importance of caring for widows who have no way to care for themselves. And this is a big thing because it's something that throughout the scriptures, God is very, very concerned about. Paul says to Timothy that any professing believer who doesn't take care of his own family member who is a widow is worse than someone who doesn't profess to follow Jesus at all. Like we see in 1 John 1, chapter 3, he says, what's the point of accurately teaching about the love of Christ if we aren't actively showing the love of Christ to one another? Finally, in chapter 6, Paul winds up the letter by reminding Timothy and us that the doctrine we are to teach and to hold to is what he calls in verse 3, the doctrine that conforms to godliness. In other words, right teaching that has as its aim right living in Christ. In verse 5, Paul identifies one major distortion of the gospel that commonly leads so many people away from true faith in Christ. The false teaching that promises that living a godly life is the way to achieve living the good life. The teaching that says godliness is a means to great gain. But Paul says true gain isn't to have things, but to have a heart that is content with whatever God gives, even if that means having only the most basic necessities like food and clothing. First of all, Paul says we can't take any of it with us when we die. So what's the point of accumulating it all? And second, the bigger issue, he says in verse 9, is that the desire to get rich, the desire to always have more, has led many people into temptation and into a sinful trap. It's led many people, he says, into foolish and harmful desires that take them down a path that leads to ruin and destruction. And we need to hear clearly what Paul says in verse 10. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and many, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So he says at the end of the chapter, don't build your life on the shaky foundation of temporary riches. Instead, be rich in love, always being ready to share with those in need. That, he says, is a true foundation that leads to true life. So for followers of Christ, Paul says in verse 11, don't get lost in the pursuit of meaningless riches. Instead, run away from that pursuit. Pursue something that's real, something that's lasting. Righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. That's what he's been saying all along. Don't teach the truth for the sake of being right. Don't try to obey the truth in hopes of getting something earthly as a reward for it. The goal of our instruction, he said at the beginning of the letter in chapter 1, is love from a pure heart and a clear conscience and a sincere faith.